This is Polyamory Weekly, tales from the front of responsible non-monogamy from a pansexual, kink-friendly point of view. A warning for our under 18 listeners. This is an adult-oriented podcast about really lascivious things, like communication and honesty in relationships. If you're under 18 and looking for upfront advice and answers to questions about sex, please visit scarletteen.com.
This is Polyamory Weekly, episode 558, for July 15th, 2018. Coming up on today's show. When do you give up on poly? That's coming up on today's show. Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Minx, and I have Allison Moon sitting in the co-host chair today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
For those who may just be tuning in for the very first time, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. I'm a sex educator and writer. I wrote a book called Girl Sex 101,
which is awesome and fully illustrated.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really, really happy with that book. And what I like about it is I wrote it for queer women, for women who love women. But about half my readers are cisgendered men because they want to know how to please their ladies. And
That's fantastic.
It makes me really happy. So so Girl Sex 101's been a good seller for me, and a lot of poly people look for that book too, because I talk about different kinds of relationship styles and different kinds of ways to organize your life. And then I also have a book called Bad Dyke, which is a collection of true stories from my sex life, which again, a lot of poly stories, a lot of queer stories, all about kind of negotiating relationships and sexuality in this modern world that we live in.
You know, I haven't read Bad Dyke. That sounds like it's fun. I should read that.
It is. I mean, some of the stories are very sweet. Most of the stories are kind of ridiculous because,
sex is often ridiculous.
Yes.
And negotiating poly is often ridiculous. Negotiating monogamy is often ridiculous.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, my big personal journey is that I was lesbian identified for a really long time, and then I fell in love with my partner, Reed Mihalko, who's a cisgender man. And it became a exploration for me to not only renegotiate non-monogamy and monogamy and how we wanted our relationship to work, but also renegotiating my own sexual identity, kind of having to come to terms with maybe I'm not a lesbian anymore, and how that felt, in terms of community, might possibly losing friends, a lot of the complications that come up when your identity shifts. So
yeah, especially when you work so hard to build community around a certain identity, and then that identity kind of fades a little bit, maybe shifts to something a little bit different, so a little bit more fluid, and now maybe your community isn't quite so much your community anymore.
Right. Especially when your community defines itself on what they don't do. And the lesbian community kind of, in many different places and many different ways, kind of defines themselves as being people who don't sleep with men rather than people who love women. And that created some strife for me, being worried that I would be, excommunicated from my community.
Were you?
Luckily, no. I did have one issue with one friend who just didn't like the idea of me being with a man. But that was very clearly her own stuff. Otherwise, people met him, they got him, and they got that our relationship really, really worked. And I was very happy with that. And, because I'm non-monogamous, most of my other partners are women. So I still very much feel connected to queer women community. And I think my non-monogamy, my polyamory allows me to feel connected that way because I can still date and I can still be sexual with women, and I can still very much be engaged in queer women's community. So I didn't feel like I had to give up my complete identity. I mean, there are plenty of monogamous bisexual people, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think that for me, it was really important that I could still keep my intimate relationships with women alive.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, it's wonderful just to sit and talk with you. I feel like when you come on the show, there's a book or there always has to be a reason. I love that this time you're in town.
Yeah.
And let's just get behind the mic and chat.
Yeah, totally. No, it's always a pleasure to see you.
Although we actually did a panel together weekend before last. I brought Allison in for a panel on what was, for me, I think this was the first conference where I had actually submitted to speak, where they didn't reach out and ask me, because it was Miss FisherCon. For those who aren't aware, Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries is a TV show out of Australia that has a feminist detective lead, and it's set in 1928, by the way, so the costumes are fabulous.
Oh my God, the costumes are just splendid.
I watch for the costumes. I have no shame about that. I will watch TV and movie just for the costumes. I will. And it has this fan convention, second year, and it was in Portland nearby. So I submitted to speak a panel on sex positivity. And Allison Moon here was one of our panelists. And I also brought in Dr. Liz, whom you heard on the show just a few episodes ago. And we also had Bianca, who is another erotica writer, and she was and one of the show organizers, and she was on the panel as well. Mm-hmm. So it was really interesting. And it was very strange, though, because it's pretty unusual that I speak to an audience that did not come there for some type of sex positive event.
Right.
It wasn't a poly event. It wasn't a kink event. It wasn't even a sci-fi event where at least the people there's a lot of exploration of sex positive things like non-monogamy and kink in the sci-fi community. So it's very welcome. It's a known quantity there. This event was really different.
It was like 99% women, many straight.
There were
women.
like two guys there.
Yeah, there really were.
I should have known that, of course, since the character herself is middle-aged, she's a middle-aged single, non-monogamous, very smart and wealthy detective in 1928 Australia. So the room was 150 white middle-aged women and two guys.
Two very
I
supportive
love those
men.
guys, though. Yeah,
I
love
great.
those guys. They were fantastic.
Yeah, it was an interesting experience because I've gone to, some similar kinds of cons, mostly sci-fi and fantasy, because my very first two books are about lesbian werewolves. And so I've gone to a number of different cons where it's like you've got like deep sci-fi fantasy nerdery that is more accustomed to exploring non-traditional ideals around sex and gender. But yeah, this was, I thought everybody was very lovely, and I thought there were a lot of great questions that we got.
It went really well.
Yeah, it really did.
We did. The first half hour, I had some sort of stage questions where we went through some of the key aspects of the show and let every panelist talk about it and talk about, all kinds of different issues and questions and identities and whatnot. And then we opened it up to questions from the audience. And that was really interesting because a lot of people, the idea I got, correct me if I'm wrong, I think a lot of people were parents and they were interested not in anything sex positive for themselves necessarily, but they wanted to know how to talk about this with their kids. Like that was a driving factor, which makes sense if they're middle-aged, right?
Right. Well, I think
that's sort of the burning question at this point in your life.
Totally, because their kids are going through a lot of changes. But I think also culture has shifted so much where it's, these people, the people who came to the con were probably very contented in their hetero-monogamous lives, but their kids are
although
identifying.
We shouldn't assume.
No, totally.
This wasn't a conference that was devoted to sex positivity, but that doesn't mean that I know at least several of the people there that I know are lesbian. So,
totally. Yeah, totally. I didn't mean to make that judgment. I guess my point is that a lot of them had questions about their kids because their kids are identifying not as gender binary, or they're identifying not as heterosexual, and their kids are having a lot more fluid identity. And, I think when I came out, my parents could understand if I was a lesbian. My parents couldn't understand bisexuality because a lesbian's like, oh, well, you're just like me, but instead of liking only men, you like only women. But fluidity is a lot harder for some people to grasp.
Yes.
And so that's been interesting I think a lot of these people were asking were like, I just don't, my kid's so young, how can they possibly know what their gender really is? Or my kid's so young, how could they possibly know whether or not they want a monogamous relationship? And because, young people these days have so much more access to non-traditional forms of all sorts of different identities. I think a lot of them are choosing into or away from traditions based on a lot more information than maybe their parents did. Yeah.
I think we got a nice opportunity to do some really good education on things like aromantics. And there were some other things that came up too.
Yeah, the asexual spectrum.
And the asexual spectrum. Yeah, I saw people taking notes in that part. But generally, I found the audience to be really open, really curious. And we talked about specific things that happened in specific episodes. It is a fan con after all.
Yeah.
But also, they were really willing to apply some of these questions, and subject matter to their lives, which I thought was really neat.
Yes.
And I know that you and Liz both got a lot of questions afterwards.
We did, yeah. And again, like, it was for me as a sex educator, and like Liz is a sex educator as well, and kind of specializes in non-monogamy stuff. And I'm a sex educator who specializes a lot in queer stuff. And so it was fun to have people come up to us afterwards and ask us specific questions about more in-depth stuff about gender identity or about sexuality, sometimes even about like techniques, things that maybe we took for granted and just kind of saying. And they're like, what do you mean by that? A lot of clarifying questions, which I really appreciated.
Yeah, that's always nice. I want to give a shout out too to the folks who do the Miss Fisher Files, Philes podcast.
Nice.
It's the fan podcast for Miss Fisher's murder mysteries. And I know they're doing a GoFundMe campaign right now, so they can both go to attend the filming of the Miss Fisher movie that's coming up in Australia. Wow. I donated. I encourage you to as well, if you have the means. If not, and you're a fan, you should totally listen to their podcast. I'll put a link in the show notes at polyweekly.com or wherever you download your podcast. And our question this week is one that I have summarized as, when do we give up on polyamory? So I'm going to do a relatively quick summary of this letter that one of our listeners wrote in. So she and her husband opened up their marriage 2 years ago. They were together for 10 years before that. They did not open it to solve a problem. It's something they both wanted to do together. They have been listening to all the poly podcasts. They've read more than 2, Ethical Slut, 8 Things, Jealousy Survival Guide. They have already been through many of the things that people go through in their first year of poly, you know, the drama, the triads, the Google Calendar. They don't do veto power. They both created their user manuals. They both believe that love is infinite, but time is not. So here's the challenge. She says, look, we're both still struggling. We're not even close to compersion. It's just a struggle every day to just be okay with our partner being with somebody else. She says, I still do comparisons. I judge myself. I feel like I won't be able to handle it. My husband's going through bouts of depressive moods that can go for weeks, especially if he's not dating. For the first time in over a decade, we've gone to bed silent, angry, in different rooms more than once. I'll sob, disappointed and angry at myself for sobbing over something I know is irrational. Now, we understand and we fully agree with that philosophy in our heads, but I don't know that we really believe it in practice in our hearts, and I don't know that we're happier for opening up. So basically, she asks, how do you know when to give up? How do you know when to give up on trying polyamory?
Wow.
I know. It's an interesting question, right?
Yeah, it is. It's a fascinating question.
I mean, to me, we always say that the point of any relationship in it is to make the people involved in that relationship happier and healthier versions of themselves. Mm-hmm. Now, if over time, understand on any given day or week, you may not be the best version of yourself. But if over time, a relationship or the relationship structure isn't contributing to overall making you a happier and healthier version of yourself, then maybe you should go back to a relationship structure that does. I mean, that's kind of the quick answer. Yeah.
I mean, I'm wondering, without knowing why they opened up the relationship, they said that it wasn't to solve a problem, but they didn't really say like exactly what about non-monogamy or polyamory excited them.
The only thing she said is that we thought it would be wonderful to have that experience of knowing and getting to know someone and to enhance someone else's life while enhancing our own.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a super positive way of putting it. But that's exactly the right kind of reason.
Totally.
Right?
But I have to wonder if they've maybe fallen into a trap of the kind of polier than thou, right? And I know you've talked about this before, but this kind of idea that like somehow it's more evolved to be polyamorous than not. Somehow it's cooler to be polyamorous than not. And maybe they thought that it just might be better. And if it's not better, then I think you need to be okay with that. You need to be okay with saying, actually, this doesn't feel right in my true core, which is, I think, more evolved than trying to force something that just doesn't feel right, ultimately, especially when they've done all this homework. It makes me wonder, it's like, if it's not really true to their essence, if it doesn't really make their relationship better, then it doesn't make your relationship better. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I can't speak to it being true to their essence or not. I think only they can answer that.
Right.
We do also say that, for a lot of people, poly is something that they are, not something that they do.
Mm-hmm.
For some people, it's something that they do, not who they are. So that's a good distinction to make.
Mm-hmm.
And what's nice for them is it sounds like it's not something that they are, that they have to be, it's an identity that has been longing to burst out, which means they both kind of have the option that if it's not working, they can just stop. If it really is this frustrating and you don't have any partners that you're currently dating that are going to, you're going to screw over by just summarily dumping, then, maybe take some time to yourselves. You can either give up on poly entirely, or you could just say, you know what? We're just going to be monogamous for a year, give ourselves a break from all the processing. Who knows? I think the chances would actually be pretty good if they did that. Then wonderful poly partners would come along, because sometimes when you stop trying is when the shit happens, and it happens really well. But that's just wild surmise. It may or may not be the case. Yeah. But the truth is, it's okay to give yourself a break, especially if you don't have partners in long-term relationships that are there already. If you're really just dating around and you don't have anybody that is entangled in your life right now, why not give yourself a break and just enjoy each other's company?
Well, I like the idea of, it's not like you have to say, well, okay, never mind, we're not polyamorous. It could be like, let's just, give ourselves a 6 months to a year, just simmer down, figure out our stuff, kind of regroup, reconnect with the essence of the relationship, the core relationship. And then again, maybe at a year's time, you can say, let's try again. We feel good about this now. There's no, you have to decide for the rest of your life what you are, right? You have the option, you have the freedom of choice to step in, step out, and figure that out for yourself. I think that's a really good point.
Well, and I wonder too, it might be interesting to see if they did decide to either stop entirely or take a break, to do that postmortem and find out what was going on. I mean, I'm concerned. She says that the husband would go into depressive bouts when he doesn't have dating partners. If you go back to monogamy and he doesn't have dating partners, will that result in another depressive bout? Or will it be happy because he's not trying?
Right.
Because he's not trying to get something and not achieving it. Will that take the pressure off and let him actually just enjoy what he has?
Yeah, it makes me question how both of them are measuring success. Right? I think a lot of people, when they open a relationship, they think, great, now I'm just going to be dating a bunch, and I'm going to be sleeping with a bunch of hot people, and I'm going to be out there. And especially times you hear this with heterosexual relationships, where it's the man will often have a much harder time finding dates because of just the way that our society is set up to prize women's sexuality and
supply and demand.
Right. And so this happens. I hear this stuff all the time of the man. They open up and the man thinks that he's going to get a lot more action than he does. And then he sees his wife or girlfriend going out there and definitely getting a lot more action.
There's a lot of dick in this world. There's a lot of free dick in this
cheap.
world. And we can be really, really picky about it.
But, But that's, and so if he's measuring success about how many different people he's dating or how much he's dating, then I could see that. And if she's measuring her success based on how not jealous she feels,
good point.
That could be a problem too. And I've definitely encountered that before in my own relationships. I do get jealous, and I often judge myself for getting jealous. And then you just kind of get sucked into this self-loathing quagmire.
Yeah, you go in this sort of vicious vortex of, self-flagellation, which for some people can be fun. But that reminds me something I did want to say. And it does sound like our listener is very self-critical of having certain emotions. And she said several times in her letter, I know I shouldn't feel this way. And here's the thing. Everything that you feel is okay. It is okay to feel jealous. It is okay to feel envious. It is okay to feel selfish. Everything that you feel is okay. So please, I beg of you, stop chastising yourself for having emotions that are completely and 100% natural to you. Now, those emotions do give you a point to start talking and questioning and figuring out, why in particular am I jealous? Let me drill down and see what specifically is bothering me. We have an and then what exercise. If you go to polyweekly.com/blog and do a search for and then what, you'll find the exercise that will help you drill down and figure out exactly what it is that's at the root of that insecurity. It doesn't make it go away, but it makes it much easier to deal with. And over time, it really does diminish that feeling.
Yeah.
But those feelings are valuable. And instead of just trying to cut them out and saying I'm a bad poly person and I shouldn't feel this way, you totally should feel that way. They're there for a reason. They're wonderful defense mechanisms. But let's look at them and see, do I need this defense anymore? Sometimes there is a reason for it. Sometimes it's, going to inform the type of polyamory that you end up practicing if you do end up practicing. There are some things that I know I need in polyamory. I know I need communication. I can't have a metamor or a partner that won't talk to me. I can't deal with the unknown. I need lines of communication open, right? That's something I know about myself. If they're not willing to sit down with me and meet me at least once, I know that type of poly doesn't work for me. And maybe there's some type of poly that you find through these exploration works for you. So I like, Allison, what you're saying about measures of success. It's like, it's a good point. I mean, it sounds like they're unhappy, and that's a good data point. But also, if what they're looking for is, one long-term partner or two long-term partners, or each one has something, we don't know exactly what their success metrics are. But I would encourage you to take your, the emotions that you're concerned about and use those to know yourself better. Now, whether you decide to continue to be polyamorous or you decide to go back to non-monogamy, those explorations will continue to be valuable to you. So it's not like you're wasting your time if you do say, okay, Mink said it was all right, so fuck it, we're monogamous. That's still going to be really valuable to figure out why you felt that way and why you had those reactions.
Yeah. When Reed and I teach a workshop about polyamory and kind of polycurious. So for people who are curious if they are, how to approach it from the beginning. And I always talk about jealousy because it's so important. And we use a metaphor that jealousy is a dashboard light. The check engine light goes on in your car. It doesn't mean you have to pull over. It doesn't mean you're a bad driver. It doesn't mean anything other than there's something going on that you need to investigate. And it doesn't mean that it feels good. But when jealousy happens in my life, and it happens less now than it did at the earlier stages of my relationship, but when it does happen, it's almost always an opportunity for me to figure out what's not right in myself. Yes. And the example and what I liked about the letter writer was that, I certainly as a woman, have a lot of issues with my own identity and a lot of my gender presentation and my sexuality because it's such a complicated thing to be a woman in the world. And the society really does try and get us to compare ourselves to each other. And so for at the very beginning of my relationship with Reed, when he would be bringing home lovers that were very feminine, that were very, extroverted, that I found myself really intimidated. And it had nothing to do with my security in my relationship with my partner. It had a lot to do with my security in my relationship to my gender identity and my femininity and how I felt like I moved through the world. And it was an opportunity for me to think wow, do I really want to have long, beautiful, flowy mermaid hair and be a party girl? Or do I just feel like that's what society tells me I should want? And when I see a woman who represents that my partner is really excited about, it makes me feel pulled towards what, traditional ideals of femininity, not necessarily anything to do with my partner and his desires. But that's just one example. I think that there's so many opportunities for people to be drill down into that jealousy, really figure out where it's coming from, because it's often an opportunity for you to get better at something with your own self.
I agree. I think that'd be really helpful. Is there anything else we want to say to our letter writer? I feel like we kind of gave her a couple of options and a couple of perspectives. We kind of turned the cube a couple of different ways.
Well, I'm kind of curious, and they said that they did so much homework, and I think that's great, and I think that's really cool. And I'm sure that there's a lot of all of the user manuals and stuff. But I have to also wonder if maybe they did this with such earnestness that they feel like the sunk cost fallacy. They've done so much work to try and make this work that now cutting and running or changing your mind feels too hard. It feels like maybe they've wasted their time. And that's a real problem, right? You feel like now you have to prove something to somebody or yourself in order to make all of that work that you did worth it.
Yeah. And it is a fallacy. Any economist will tell you should never consider sunk cost when making your decision. And yet people do because you put all this effort in, right? But I would reiterate what Allison says. First of all, I don't think those are sunk. I don't think they're sunk into polyamory at any rate. Those conversations that you had, those user manuals that you wrote, those books that you read, those are all about improving communication, improving self-awareness. Those are all going to make you better at any type of relationship, whether it's poly, mono, or anything in between. So if you have a little bit of that sunk cost philosophy going in, just keep in mind that you're still getting the benefits of those, all the effort that you've put in, even if you decide that monogamy is really the best thing for you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that wraps it up for today's show. Thanks again to Allison Moon for co-hosting today. Where can our lovely listeners find you?
Well, I have a new podcast called Artgasm that's all about the intersections of pop culture, art, and sexuality.
Ooh.
So you can listen to me there.
And that's on Apple Podcasts, wherever we listen to podcasts.
All the places, and artgasmcast.com is where you can find the website. And then also I'm on Twitter at HeyAllieMoon or on the web at girlsex101.com.
And we'll provide those links in the show notes. Thanks again to Allison for co-hosting today. It was a lot of fun.
This was great.
Got me back behind the mic. I've been having too much fun playing this summer. I want to thank all our Polyweekly Playmates for the generous donations this week. We're a free resource. We've helped hundreds of thousands of people navigate their introduction to and continued success with polyamory, and your donations, whether financial or email contributions, keep the podcast free and awesome for everybody, both inside and outside the community. Comments, question, feedback, email polyweekly@gmail.com. If you'd like to book us for something, email lustyguy@polyweekly.com. You can also call our comment line, 802-505-POLY, or check out our Facebook page, facebook.com/polyweekly, or Twitter @polyweekly. Thanks for listening, and remember, it's not all about the sex.